Dakar was glowing that evening, the kind of city night where the air carried both music and ocean breeze. Amara adjusted her simple dress as she stood outside the tall gates of a mansion she had only seen from afar. Her boss, Monsieur Diallo, one of the most powerful men in the firm, was celebrating his birthday, and against all odds, she had been invited. The invitation had surprised her so much that she read it 3 times, wondering if it was a mistake. Junior employees like her didn't belong in the same space as the wealthy, the connected, the ones who drank champagne as if it were water. She walked into the garden where laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Women shimmered in designer gowns. Men wore suits cut sharp enough to draw stares, and everywhere she turned there was a sparkle of money and confidence. Amara, with her neatly pressed but modest outfit, felt the weight of every glance. She wasn't poor, but compared to them she looked like she had come from another world entirely. Still, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her heart beating fast, her smile careful and polite. She tried to blend into the background, but even in silence she knew she stood out. A voice inside whispered that this invitation was not kindness, but something else, something she could not yet name. Monsieur Diallo watched her from across the room with the faintest smirk, as though he already knew she was stepping into a game she hadn't agreed to play. The party grew louder as the night deepened. Inside the grand living room, Monsieur Diallo stood at the center like a king in his court. His friends surrounded him, men and women polished to perfection, their voices rolling smoothly in French. They spoke fast, laughing at every sentence, their champagne glasses never empty. It was not just conversation, it was performance. Every word was meant to show their education, their class, their place above others. Diallo thrived in this circle. He had studied in Paris, and he made sure everyone remembered it. He liked to drop stories about French cafés, about wine, about professors who once praised him. His friends responded with admiration, though some were clearly more interested in staying in his good graces than in the stories themselves. Together they gossiped about people from the office, sometimes naming them, sometimes disguising their words in a joke. A few names Amara recognized. She heard her colleagues' weaknesses being turned into entertainment, each story followed by laughter that felt sharp, almost cruel. Amara stood near the edge of the group, quiet but attentive. She held her glass carefully, listening without letting her face betray anything. Though they switched into French often, assuming not everyone could follow, every word was clear to her. She had grown up with the language, had lived with it in books, in conversations at home, in the memory of her father's voice. Yet here, she let herself look like an outsider, someone who only smiled politely without catching the meaning. They looked past her as if she were decoration, not a person. The women tilted their heads with practiced laughter, the men slapped each other's backs, and the music of their mockery filled the room. Every so often, Diallo's eyes flicked toward Amara. It was not the glance of a welcoming host, but of a man waiting for the right moment. He seemed to enjoy how small she looked in comparison to the rest, how her silence made her appear lost. But Amara's silence was not weakness. It was a shield. She knew if she spoke now, they would twist her words into more laughter. So she stayed still, her expression calm, her breathing steady, even when the sting of their arrogance cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Inside, her thoughts were sharp, but outside she let them believe she was harmless, unknowing, invisible. What they did not see was her strength and restraint. Every cruel laugh was another test of her patience. Every careless insult about the staff was a reminder of how fragile their false power really was. She stood there quietly, but her silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone who understood everything, and was simply waiting. The music softened and the laughter shifted as Diallo turned his full attention to Amara. She felt his eyes sweep over her from head to toe, not with kindness but with something sharper, something meant to cut. He raised his glass and leaned closer to his circle, his voice slipping into French. "Regard ses habits," he said with a smirk. "Look at her clothes." Then louder, so his friends could hear, he added, "Cheap village fabric, straight from the market stalls." The group erupted into laughter. It was not the warm kind that fills a room, but the cruel kind that stings like smoke in the eye. The women covered their mouths as they giggled. The men nodded in agreement, clinking their glasses. Not one of them thought for a second that Amara understood. To them, she was just standing there, dumb and blind to their mockery. Amara kept her smile steady. She felt her cheeks warm, not from shame but from the fire she was holding back. Her dress was simple. It was not designer or imported, but it had been chosen with care, pressed with her own hands, worn with quiet pride. Now, each laugh at her expense pressed down on her chest like a weight. As if French was not enough, they switched into English. One man, trying to mimic a street vendor, waved his hand and said in a mocking tone, "2 for 1, madam. Special price, madam." The table roared again. Another chimed in, "That's how she talks at work, like a seller on the side of the road." Amara's heart thudded. her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. The insult about her accent sliced deeper than the comment about her clothes. Language had always been her gift, her father's legacy. To hear them reduce her voice to a joke, it burned more than she could show. Still, her lips curved into that same polite smile, her eyes calm, her body unmoving. They mistook her silence for ignorance, and that gave them courage. Diallo leaned back, proud of the laughter he had sparked. He enjoyed the role of entertainer, and Amara was his unwilling stage. Every cruel word seemed to make him taller in the eyes of his friends, and every silent second from Amara seemed to prove she was beneath them. But inside, Amara was not shrinking. She was storing each insult, each laugh, each mocking glance. Her silence was not weakness, it was armor. She let them think she was small because she knew something they did not. She understood every word. And when the time came, the very language they used to humiliate her would become the language that shattered their pride. For now she smiled, but behind that smile was fire. As the laughter carried on around her, Amara's mind drifted far from the glittering lights of the mansion. She thought of her father, the man who had shaped her world before life took him too soon. He had been a French professor at the university, a man of quiet dignity who believed that language was more than words. To him, French was a bridge. It opened doors, carried respect, and gave a voice in rooms where silence might otherwise swallow you. As a child, Amara would sit beside him as he corrected papers, listening to the way he rolled each phrase with care. He used to quiz her gently, asking her to translate stories, proverbs, even jokes. She grew up speaking Wolof in the streets and at home with family, but French was her father's gift, wrapped in patience and love. By the time she was 12, she could switch between the two languages as easily as breathing. But after her father's death, the house changed. Her stepmother, practical and hardened by survival, never valued words the way he did. She often looked at Amara with a tired shake of her head. "Speaking French won't fill your stomach," she said once, watching the girl read out loud from her father's old books. "Better you learn a trade, something useful. This language of the white man will not buy rice for the table." Amara never argued, but the words cut her. She clung even harder to her father's lessons, reading his notes late into the night, whispering French phrases to herself, as if to keep him alive. For her, every sentence was not only knowledge but memory, a piece of him that could not be taken away. When she started working at Diallo's firm, she made a choice to keep this part of herself hidden. She watched how the executives used French as a tool to separate themselves from everyone else, as if the language alone made them better. She noticed how the junior staff would nod politely, unable to follow, excluded without a word of rejection. So Amara stayed quiet. She let them believe she belonged only to the lower ranks, that her tongue was too heavy for their polished world. What they didn't know was that every meeting, every casual comment, every hushed joke was clear to her. She understood all of it, but she chose silence. In that silence, she carried her father's voice like a shield. They thought she was powerless because she didn't speak, but her power lay in the waiting. Now, as she stood in the middle of Diallo's party, their laughter echoing around her, she felt the weight of her father's gift more than ever. They mocked her clothes, her accent, her very presence. Yet deep down she knew the same weapon they used to belittle her was the one she had mastered long. French was not their tool alone, it was hers. And when the right moment came, it would be the fire they never saw coming. The laughter in the room swelled again, rolling like a wave that refused to break. Diallo's friends were in full performance now, their jokes circling Amara as if she were some kind of toy at the center of their game. One man, tall and smug with his tie loosened, leaned back in his chair and looked her up and down. Then, with a grin that dripped with arrogance, he said in French, "She doesn't look like an employee at Diallo's firm. She looks more like a waitress. Someone should hand her a tray." The group burst out laughing. Glasses clinked, heads tilted back, rings of champagne sloshing in crystal cups. Even those who hadn't heard clearly joined in, because laughter spreads easily when cruelty feels safe. Diallo chuckled too, not stopping his friend, not softening the blow, but enjoying the scene like a man pleased with his entertainment. Amara's hand tightened around her glass until she could hear the faintest creak of the stem. Her knuckles went white, her breath shallow. She stared at the bubbles rising in the drink, fighting the urge to throw it down and shout. Every part of her body trembled, but her face stayed calm, her smile fixed. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Inside, though, her thoughts burned. A waitress? That's all they see? After the years I've studied, the nights I've worked, the battles I've fought? Each laugh around her pressed harder, like a hand shoving her down. Her chest felt tight, her ears hot, her dignity scraped raw. She lowered her gaze and whispered to herself, so quietly no one else could hear. "They think I am powerless because I am silent." The words came out almost like a vow, a reminder to herself that silence was not weakness, that silence could also be strength. Still, her heart pounded with the question. How much more could she take? The party carried on as if nothing had happened, but for Amara the moment stretched long and heavy. She felt trapped between two choices, to endure or to explode. She could storm out and leave them with their laughter, but that would mean giving them the victory. She could speak and reveal her secret, but that would change everything in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. Her glass trembled again in her hand. She thought of her father, of his quiet strength, of the way he always said, "A wise person knows when to speak and when to wait." She swallowed hard, her lips pressed tight, her eyes shining not with tears but with fire. Around her, the guests moved on, laughing at new jokes, clinking glasses, never realizing how close the room had come to breaking. But inside Amara, the line had been drawn. She would not forget. She would not forgive. She would wait, just a little longer, for the right moment to let her silence end. The moment came when the room was at its loudest. Diallo, standing tall with his glass raised high, called for silence. The music softened, the chatter dimmed, and all eyes turned to him. He smiled, soaking in the attention, his face glowing with pride. He lifted his glass toward Amara, not in honor but in mockery. "This one," he said, his voice smooth and heavy with arrogance, "is only here as decoration. A flower in the corner. Useless, but at least she makes the room look full." His friends burst into laughter once more, clapping and whistling at his cruel joke. The words rang in Amara's ears, sharper than any blade. Her chest rose and fell as she gripped her glass tighter. Something inside her snapped, not with rage, but with clarity. Enough. The silence she had carried all night broke open. She lifted her chin, stepped forward, and spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and flawless in French. "Decoration inutile?" she repeated, her words cutting through the air. The laughter stopped instantly. Heads turned, mouths froze, and the room fell into stunned silence. No one had expected her to respond, and certainly not in their language. She continued, her French smooth and precise, not a single word stumbling. She didn't just speak, she commanded the space. And then, as if to slice through their pride, she corrected the grammar of one of Diallo's earlier phrases. The insult turned back on him like a mirror. Gasps echoed around the room. Some guests exchanged glances, their jaws dropping. They had assumed she understood nothing, that she was blind to every word they had used against her. Now the truth hit them like a storm. Amara's eyes swept the circle, steady and unafraid. Then she delivered the line that struck deepest, quoting a proverb her father had once told her. "Celui qui rit de autres, rit de lui-même le premier." He who laughs at others, laughs at himself first. The words landed heavy. The silence that followed was almost painful, stretching through the air. Diallo's smirk melted, his hand frozen in midair, his glass trembling slightly. His friends looked away, their earlier arrogance shrinking into embarrassment. No one dared laugh now. Amara stood tall, her voice still calm, her presence suddenly larger than the room itself. For the first time that night, she wasn't the outsider, the target, or the decoration. She was the center, and every eye stayed on her, not in mockery but in awe. The tables had turned in a single breath. Where they had expected weakness, she revealed strength. Where they had expected ignorance, she revealed mastery. And in that silence, with jaws still hanging open, Amara held her ground, her father's gift shining through her every word. The air in the room had shifted. What had been laughter and mockery only moments ago was now a heavy silence, every guest waiting for what Amara might say next. She could feel their eyes on her, wide with surprise, some with admiration, others with disbelief. For the first time that evening, she was no longer invisible. Amara's voice grew steadier, her confidence blooming as she spoke again in French. She moved through her sentences with elegance, weaving in phrases and proverbs that showed not just fluency but depth. Her accent was clear, her tone calm, and her words carried weight. The same people who had laughed at her were now hanging on to each syllable. Then, with a small pause, she switched to Wolof. The shift was seamless, her voice rolling with the rhythm of the language of her people. A few older guests nodded with respect, recognizing the power of someone who could master both worlds so easily. She floated between the two languages, French and Wolof, like a dancer moving across a stage, proving without saying it outright that she did not just belong in the room. She commanded it. At the far side of the gathering, some of the more important guests, the ones who had stood quietly during all the laughter, began to murmur. Among them were investors and an ambassador known for his sharp eye. The ambassador leaned forward, smiling warmly, and when Amara paused, he raised his glass in her direction. "Brilliant," he said clearly for all to hear. "A mind like this is rare. Intelligence with humility." The compliment rang louder than any insult had. The room shifted again, this time in her favor. People nodded, some even clapped softly, eager to align themselves with the ambassador's praise. Amara lowered her head slightly, thanking him with grace, her poise only adding to the impression she had already made. Meanwhile, Diallo's face was beginning to shine with sweat. His smirk was gone, his shoulders stiff. The man who had just mocked her with confidence now looked cornered. He tried to laugh, to brush it off as a misunderstanding, but the sound came out thin and forced. His circle of friends avoided his eyes, embarrassed to be caught on the wrong side of the moment. Amara didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The power in the room had already shifted. She had been the target, the decoration, the joke. Now, she was the voice that silenced them, the presence that demanded respect. Each word she spoke reminded them that they had misjudged her, that they had underestimated the very person who now stood higher than all of them. What Diallo had built all evening with arrogance collapsed in an instant. In front of his own friends, in his own house, on his own birthday, the man who thought he was untouchable was left small. And Amara, with nothing but her voice, had turned the tables completely. The party slowly picked up again, but it was not the same as before. The loud laughter had quieted, replaced by whispers and curious glances toward Amara. She no longer stood in the shadows. People moved closer, eager to hear her words, to introduce themselves, to be seen near her. Diallo, on the other hand, lingered at the edge of conversations, his smile tight, his hands restless around his glass. As the music flowed and waiters passed with trays, one of the high-profile investors stepped toward Amara. He was an older man, well-respected, his presence commanding without effort. He greeted her warmly in French, then switched to Wolof, clearly impressed by what he had heard earlier. After a short exchange, he leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to keep the conversation private. "You have a gift," he told her, "not only in language, but in how you carry yourself. My company could use someone like you. We are expanding, and I would like to offer you a position, something worthy of your intelligence." Amara's heart skipped. She had not expected such words tonight, not here of all places. She kept her composure, but inside she felt a swell of pride, the kind that carried her father's voice with it. She thanked the man softly, her tone respectful but steady. What she didn't notice at first was Diallo, standing only a few steps away, pretending to be engaged in another conversation. His ear had caught every word. His jaw tightened as he realized what was happening. The employee he had mocked, the woman he had tried to humiliate in front of his powerful friends, was being courted right in his own home. Worse, if she accepted, she would leave not as a failure, but as someone valued by his own peers. The connections he so carefully flaunted could slip away, drawn instead to Amara. Diallo moved quickly, cutting into the moment with a forced laugh. "Ah, my dear Amara," he said loudly, "you must forgive us tonight. My friends drink too much and joke too harshly. You know how parties can be. You are, of course, a valued member of the team." He placed a hand on her shoulder as if to claim her, to show the others that she still belonged to him, his employee, his decoration. But his words felt hollow, too late, like a weak patch over a deep crack. The investor's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he had seen through the performance. Amara simply smiled, polite but not eager, her silence sharper than any rejection. The damage was already done. The balance had shifted, and everyone could see it. Diallo had tried to reduce her to nothing, but in the end, she was the one being offered something greater, right under his nose. And no amount of smooth talk could erase the fact that the night had revealed who truly held the power. The night had taken a turn no one expected. What was supposed to be Diallo's shining moment, a party to show his wealth and power, had shifted into something entirely different. The laughter that once circled around him now circled around Amara, though not in mockery, this time in admiration. People whispered her name, repeated her words, and stole glances as if they were seeing her for the first time. Amara felt it too, the weight of the attention. Yet she didn't let pride consume her. She stood tall, calm, almost serene, her face lit by quiet strength. She knew the power she now held, but she didn't need to flaunt it. That was Diallo's way, not hers. When the music rose again and the crowd loosened, Amara lifted her glass one last time. Her voice carried gently but firmly through the air, in French, clear and flawless. She thanked the host, she thanked the guests, and she ended with a graceful nod that left no space for pity or for mockery. Her words were short, but they struck with the elegance of someone who had nothing to prove. The room responded with applause, not loud or forced, but genuine. Some people smiled warmly at her, others exchanged murmurs, but one thing was certain, the night now belonged to her. The whispers grew, threads of conversation weaving her name into every corner of the celebration. No one was talking about Diallo's birthday anymore. They were talking about Amara, the young woman who had been underestimated and who, with only her words, turned the whole room on its head. Diallo stood frozen, his forced smile beginning to fade. His eyes darted from guest to guest, watching as their admiration slipped away from him and gathered around the very person he had tried to humiliate. His chest tightened with shame, but there was nothing he could do. To protest would only expose his weakness further. To pretend pride would only make his humiliation clearer. Amara did not argue. She did not gloat. She did not even look at him as she set down her glass and turned toward the door. Her silence was her justice. Each step she took toward leaving was heavier than any insult she could have thrown back. By walking away with grace, she left him with something far worse than anger. She left him with irrelevance. The crowd buzzed louder after she left, the sound of her name echoing against the walls of the mansion. Diallo's friends tried to lift the mood again, but it was too late. The spotlight had moved. The man who had once commanded the room was now just another guest at his own party, his celebration soured, his pride shattered. And outside, in the cool Dakar night, Amara walked calmly, her dignity intact, her silence speaking louder than anything she could have said. Weeks passed, and Amara's life began to change. The investor who had spoken to her that night kept his word. She joined his firm, not as a small junior employee, but in a role that gave her responsibility, respect, and room to grow. For the first time, she felt her voice carried weight not just in private, but in the world around her. She worked hard, proving day by day that the offer had not been charity but recognition of her true worth. The news of her rise traveled fast. In Dakar, people spoke of her story like a lesson. Some called it fate, others called it justice. Even those who had once overlooked her at Diallo's firm now whispered her name with admiration, as if they had always known she would go far. One evening, in a modest living room far from the glittering mansions, her stepmother sat in front of the TV. On the screen, Amara stood at an international conference, speaking fluent French to an audience of leaders and diplomats. She was calm, elegant, her words carrying strength and clarity. The stepmother, who once said speaking French won't fill your stomach, stared in silence, her eyes wide. There was no denying it now. The very gift she had dismissed had carried Amara farther than anyone had imagined. The camera caught Amara smiling as she ended her speech, the applause rising behind. Across homes, offices, and screens, people felt the message without her needing to say it outright. Never underestimate the quiet one. Their silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is louder than every insult, every laugh, every attempt to bring them down. And in that truth, Amara's story found its justice.